Stop begging the outer world for money. Begging declares lack. The moment you decree instead, the shadow rearranges itself. Money does not respond to need. It responds to assumption. This is where the correction offered by Neville Goddard cuts against nearly everything people have been taught. Needing, he said plainly, is an assumption of absence. It is not neutral. It is not harmless. It is a declaration made at the level of identity that what you want is not yours. When you say, "I need money," even silently, you are not asking life to change. You are informing consciousness of who you believe yourself to be. The law does not respond to effort or sincerity. It responds to assumption, and assumption is always identity wearing a feeling. Neville often illustrated this with a striking analogy: praying to a God you believe is separate from you. In that posture, prayer becomes pleading, and pleading only reinforces the distance between the one who asks and the thing desired. The moment you imagine a power outside yourself that must be convinced, persuaded, or moved, you have already placed yourself in the position of the beggar. You may call it faith, you may call it devotion, but if the emotional posture is one of reaching upward from lack, the assumption underneath is still separation. And separation is simply lack given a spiritual name. This is why begging must be understood correctly. Begging is rarely loud, it is rarely dramatic. It is not the words spoken aloud or the affirmations written in a notebook. Begging lives in subtle inner speech, in the tone behind the thought, in the feeling of waiting for permission. It shows up as hope strained with anxiety, as gratitude layered with tension, as visualization that feels like effort rather than remembrance. You may tell yourself you are being disciplined or spiritual, but the body often tells a different story. The body knows when it is bracing, when it is leaning forward, when it is trying to pull something toward itself instead of resting in possession. Modern neuroscience echoes this ancient observation. Joe Dispenza has pointed out that emotional dependency signals lack and sustains it neurologically. When the nervous system is conditioned into states of wanting, hoping, and needing, it repeatedly fires the same circuits associated with absence. The brain and body learn lack as a familiar state. Over time, this state becomes home, and anything that threatens to remove it can feel strangely unsafe. In this way, the habit of begging is not only spiritual, it is biological. It becomes a loop that feels normal, even righteous, while quietly perpetuating the very condition it claims to escape. The thesis, then, is not complicated, but it is deeply confronting. Money does not begin to flow when you find better words, longer affirmations, or more emotional intensity. It flows when the identity of need collapses, when the inner posture shifts from someone trying to get money to someone for whom money is a normal, expected part of life. The entire mechanism changes. Nothing is forced. Nothing is chased. The mirror simply reflects a new stance. And as you will see, the moment this collapse occurs, effort becomes unnecessary, repetition becomes irrelevant, and receiving replaces asking without drama or delay. At first, repetition feels reassuring. It gives the mind something to hold, something familiar to return to when uncertainty arises. Repeating money affirmations can feel like discipline, like persistence, even like faith. Yet beneath that rhythm of repetition, there is often an unexamined assumption quietly at work. The assumption is that saying something again and again will eventually force reality to comply, but the law Neville spoke of was never impressed by effort. It responds only to the state from which effort arises. When repetition is born from identity unchanged, it does not dissolve lack. It rehearses it. Consider the image of someone knocking repeatedly on a door that already belongs to them. The knocking itself is not wrong, but it reveals confusion about ownership. If the house were truly known as yours, knocking would feel absurd. You would simply enter. In the same way, affirmations spoken from the feeling of still being outside the door reinforce the belief that access has not yet been granted. Each repetition becomes a reminder that you believe yourself to be waiting. The door does not open because, in consciousness, it was never assumed to be open. This is why so many people report exhaustion rather than relief from constant affirmation. The words may be positive, but the inner position is strained. There is effort, monitoring, and a subtle fear that if the repetition stops, progress will be lost. That fear is not accidental. It is the signature of an identity that does not yet trust possession. Repetition in this case is not an act of power. It is an attempt to compensate for doubt, And doubt, when repeated faithfully, produces exactly what it believes in. The disruption comes when you notice that nothing external is failing. The technique is not broken. The law is not withholding. If repetition fails, the inner position must be wrong. This realization is uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of doing more. It suggests that the solution is not increased effort, but a collapse of the one who is trying. The moment this is seen clearly, repetition loses its urgency. It no longer feels necessary to convince, persuade, or remind. Something deeper begins to shift, and that shift has nothing to do with words at all. There is a profound reversal that takes place when you begin to see how money actually responds. Most people approach it as though it were a distant force that must be softened, appealed to, or convinced to arrive. This approach feels natural because it mirrors how they relate to authority in the external world. They ask, they wait, and they hope for approval. Yet money, like all reflections of consciousness, does not respond to pleading. It responds to authority. Authority is not volume, confidence in speech, or emotional intensity. It is a quiet, settled knowing that does not explain itself. Authority lives entirely in the inner position. It is the difference between someone who believes they are entitled to act and someone who feels they must request permission. Imagine a manager assigning work. There is no emotional charge in the instruction, no anxiety about whether it will be accepted. The assignment is given because the role itself implies authority. Now contrast that with an intern hesitating, carefully asking if it might be acceptable to contribute. The words may be polite, even intelligent, but the posture is uncertain. Money responds to the first posture, not because it favors confidence, but because confidence reveals identity. This is why assumption is command, not request. When you assume, you are not speaking to be heard. You are speaking from a position that expects movement. The inner world aligns around that expectation effortlessly. There is no sense of pushing reality forward or dragging it into place. Authority does not rush. It does not monitor outcomes. It does not feel the need to repeat itself. The command has already been issued at the level of being, and what follows feels inevitable rather than hoped for. The most subtle misunderstanding is believing that authority must be spoken aloud. In truth, the spoken word often lags behind the inner verdict. You can say nothing and still command, or speak constantly and still plead. Authority is felt internally as calm finality. It is the sensation that the matter is already decided, not because you forced it, but because it aligns with who you know yourself to be. When this internal authority is present, money does not arrive as a reward. It arrives as confirmation. And in that confirmation, something unmistakable becomes clear. You were never meant to ask. You were meant to assume and let the assumption speak for you. There is a quiet sophistication to the way begging disguises itself. It rarely appears as desperation, especially among those who consider themselves spiritually aware. Instead, it slips into practices that look refined, respectable, even enlightened. Gratitude becomes strained, visualization becomes effortful, and hope becomes a gentle form of waiting. On the surface, everything appears aligned. Beneath it, however, the emotional posture remains unchanged. The feeling is still one of reaching rather than resting, of monitoring rather than knowing. Gratitude, when misunderstood, can carry the same tension as a plea. It sounds like appreciation, but it feels like anticipation. There is a nervous edge to it, as though saying thank you is meant to secure approval rather than acknowledge ownership. It is the emotional equivalent of smiling while waiting to see if the answer will be yes. In this posture, gratitude is not an expression of fulfillment. It is a strategy, and strategies always reveal that the desired state has not yet been assumed. Visualization follows a similar pattern. When it is driven by hope, it becomes an act of trying to make something happen. The image is constructed carefully, repeated faithfully, and evaluated constantly for emotional intensity. Yet the very effort to visualize well exposes the underlying belief that the scene is not natural yet. If it were natural, it would arise effortlessly like a memory rather than a fantasy. Hope keeps the image in the future, and as long as it remains there, the present self continues to experience absence. Even hope itself, so often praised, can quietly sustain lack. Hope implies that something may arrive, not that it already belongs. It keeps consciousness leaning forward, watching, checking, and waiting for confirmation. The inner posture does not change, so the outer reflection has no reason to. The law does not respond to beautiful techniques performed from the wrong stance. Emotional posture matters more than technique because posture reveals identity, and identity is the only thing being mirrored. The shift occurs when this is seen without judgment. Nothing needs to be corrected or perfected. The posture must change before results can. When gratitude feels like acknowledgement rather than persuasion, when visualization feels like recognition rather than effort, and when hope dissolves into quiet expectation, the act of begging loses its hiding places. What remains is not a better practice but a different state of being, and from that state, money no longer feels distant. It feels already accounted for, already included, already settled. There is a subtle but decisive shift that separates those who struggle with money from those for whom it feels ordinary. That shift is not found in motivation or optimism, but in expectation. Needing carries tension, expecting carries calm. When you need money, the body leans forward, the mind calculates, and the emotions scan constantly for signs of arrival. When you expect money, none of that happens. There is no urgency, no emotional charge, no internal debate. Expectation signals possession because it assumes continuity rather than interruption. Think of how you relate to something you already regard as stable in your life. A paycheck, for example, is rarely celebrated in advance or worried over each morning. It is expected. You do not rehearse affirmations about it. You do not visualize it intensely. You simply live from the assumption that it will arrive, and because that assumption feels natural, it does. The expectation is so quiet that it often goes unnoticed, yet it is precisely this quietness that gives it power. There is no emotional spike because there is no question being asked. This is why expectation cannot be installed through conscious effort. Effort implies that something is missing. The more you try to expect, the more you confirm that you are not there yet. Expectation is installed beneath conscious effort, at the level of identity. It emerges when the idea of having becomes more familiar than the idea of lacking. At that point, the nervous system relaxes, the inner dialogue softens, and the mind stops scanning for proof. The assumption settles in as a background truth rather than a foreground activity. As this shift takes place, money begins to feel less like an object of pursuit and more like a feature of the environment. It is no longer central to thought because it no longer defines identity. Just as you do not think constantly about the floor supporting you, you stop thinking constantly about money supporting your life. It is simply there. And in that simplicity, the struggle dissolves. The shift from needing to expecting does not announce itself dramatically. It feels almost anticlimactic, yet it marks the moment when money stops being something you chase and becomes something that follows. There is a depth to the state akin to sleep that is often missed because it is approached as a technique rather than a state of being. Neville did not present ersatz as a mental exercise meant to impress the subconscious through force or repetition. He spoke of it as a threshold, a gentle crossing from the outer world of effort into an inner world where identity becomes fluid. In this softened condition, the mind is no longer preoccupied with defending its familiar story. The vigilance that usually accompanies thoughts of money begins to relax, and in that relaxation, the one who has been striving quietly steps aside. Throughout the day, the beggar identity is kept alive through constant reinforcement. It is reinforced by inner commentary, by small emotional reactions to bills, prices, and comparisons, and by the habitual sense of responsibility that feels indistinguishable from pressure. Even moments of optimism are often tinged with effort, as though something must be held together by willpower. Satz interrupts this entire mechanism. As the body grows heavy and the senses withdraw, the mental scaffolding that supports lack starts to loosen. Thoughts slow, not because they are being controlled, but because the state no longer feeds them energy. In this condition, the feeling of need cannot maintain its usual intensity. It requires alertness, monitoring, and emotional charge to survive. When the nervous system drifts toward rest, those supports are removed. This is why Satz feels like laying down a heavy bag you forgot you were carrying. The relief is not dramatic, but it is unmistakable. There is a sense of spaciousness where tension once lived. The identity that was defined by wanting begins to dissolve, not through confrontation, but through neglect. It is simply no longer being rehearsed. What replaces it is not a forced sense of abundance, but a quiet neutrality that allows a different feeling to emerge naturally. In SATS, the idea of being financially settled does not need to be justified. It does not need a story, a plan, or a timeline. It can be felt as a simple fact, much like the knowledge of your own name. This feeling carries no excitement because it carries no doubt. It is calm, ordinary, and strangely familiar. In that familiarity, assumption slips into place without resistance. This is why SATS is often misunderstood by those who try to do it right. The moment you attempt to perform the state, you reintroduce the identity that wants results. But when the state is allowed, something else happens. The scene, if one arises at all, feels more like a memory than a fantasy. The emotion is not desire, but satisfaction. There is no reaching forward. There is no sense of waiting. The body recognizes the feeling as safe, and safety is what allows the subconscious to accept it as real. Yet the most important aspect of SATS is what happens afterward. When you return to waking awareness, the old habits often attempt to reclaim their place. Thoughts about money may resurface, along with subtle urges to check, plan, or repeat affirmations. This does not mean the state was lost. It reveals the momentum of an identity that has been practiced for years. Each return to SATS weakens that momentum. The nervous system learns that relaxation does not lead to loss, and over time, it stops sounding the alarm. Gradually, the feeling accessed in SATS begins to bleed into ordinary moments. The calm expectation, once limited to the edge of sleep, becomes easier to touch during the day. Money-related thoughts lose their emotional charge. Decisions feel less reactive. The sense of being supported replaces the sense of striving. At this point, SATS is no longer something you enter deliberately. It becomes a reference point, a reminder of who you are when the beggar identity is absent. And in that absence, the law has nothing to contradict. At the edge of every genuine shift in identity, an adversary appears, and it rarely looks dramatic. It does not announce itself as fear. It often presents itself as responsibility, prudence, or common sense. The moment the inner tension around money begins to loosen, a quiet concern arises. If I stop managing this so closely, something will go wrong. This concern feels reasonable, even mature, yet it is rooted in a deeper belief that control is what has been holding life together. The idea of letting go is interpreted as negligence rather than trust. This fear is subtle because it borrows the language of adulthood and survival. It whispers that vigilance is necessary, that relaxation invites chaos, and that ease must be earned through constant oversight. In this way, control masquerades as responsibility. The inner world stays busy, not because it is effective, but because stillness feels unsafe. The nervous system has learned to associate tension with protection. When tension fades, the body misreads the signal and assumes something essential has been lost. The analogy is simple and revealing. Hovering over a delivery tracker after the package has already been shipped. The order is confirmed, the process is in motion, yet the mind keeps checking, refreshing, and worrying about delays. None of this activity speeds up the delivery. It only sustains the feeling of uncertainty. In the same way, constant mental supervision of money does not secure its arrival. It only reinforces the belief that arrival depends on vigilance. What makes this adversary powerful is that it feels useful. The habit of monitoring gives the illusion of participation. It creates the sense that something is being done. But beneath that sense lies exhaustion. Control demands energy, and energy expended in guarding against loss cannot be used to embody possession. The inner posture remains one of defense rather than assumption. Money, responding faithfully, mirrors that posture back as instability or delay. The turning point comes when it becomes clear that trust is not passive. It is not resignation or indifference. Trust activates a higher order of movement, one that does not require supervision to function. Just as the body regulates breathing without conscious effort, life organizes outcomes without constant mental interference. When control loosens, there is often a brief sensation of free fall. This is not a sign of danger, but a sign that the old scaffolding has been removed. As trust settles in, the mind grows quieter. Thoughts about money become practical rather than emotional. Decisions arise without urgency. The sense of carrying the entire future on your shoulders dissolves into something more balanced and humane. In this state, the adversary loses its grip. not because it has been defeated, but because it is no longer needed. Control steps aside, and in that space, flow becomes possible. Once the posture of need has relaxed and control has loosened its grip, something begins to reorganize itself quietly in the background of life. Neville referred to this unfolding as the bridge of incidents, not as a dramatic event, but as a sequence of natural movements that lead inevitably to the assumed state. The bridge does not announce itself. It does not feel magical or extraordinary. It feels ordinary, even obvious in retrospect. This ordinariness is precisely what makes it easy to overlook. When money begins to flow after the identity shift, it rarely arrives in the way the mind once imagined. There is no sudden proof designed to convince you that the law is working. Instead, there are small changes in circumstances, conversations that seem incidental, opportunities that feel timely rather than miraculous. A thought arises to take a certain action, and it feels calm rather than urgent. Someone reaches out unexpectedly, and it feels natural rather than surprising. These events do not carry emotional fireworks because they are not meant to. They are simply the external alignment of an internal decision that has already been made. This is why Neville emphasized that the bridge unfolds once need is removed. Need demands signs. It watches closely and asks whether progress is being made. When need is absent, there is no one left to monitor the process. Life is free to rearrange itself without interference. The bridge builds itself behind the scenes, using existing circumstances, existing people, and existing pathways. Nothing new has to be forced into being. What already exists is reassembled in a different order. The analogy of invitations arriving after you stop asking to be included captures this perfectly. When you are eager to be invited, every silence feels personal. Every delay feels like rejection. The moment you stop needing the invitation to validate you, they begin to arrive effortlessly, not because you tried harder, but because the posture that once blocked them has dissolved. In the same way, money begins to circulate toward you when your inner stance no longer communicates urgency or lack. The invitation was always possible. The identity was the only barrier. As the bridge progresses, one of the most noticeable shifts is emotional neutrality. You may notice money appearing through channels you would have previously dismissed as insignificant. A refund, a conversation, a chance encounter, a subtle redirection in work. The old self might have overlooked these moments or judged them as insufficient. The new self does not evaluate them emotionally. There is a quiet acceptance that this is how movement looks. Flow feels normal, not dramatic, because it matches the internal state that produced it. This normality is important. When money arrives without drama, it integrates smoothly into identity. There is no spike of excitement followed by fear of loss. There is no story built around the event. It simply becomes part of the environment, like furniture you did not realize you had rearranged. This is how stability is established, not through peaks and collapses, but through consistent, unremarkable confirmation. Over time, looking back reveals a clear sequence. What once felt random now appears coordinated. Decisions you did not understand at the time reveal their place in the larger pattern. Neville often said that the bridge must be crossed, but it need not be watched. Each incident was necessary, even the ones that seemed unrelated to money. Each step carried you away from the identity of striving and closer to the identity of expectation. When this is understood, impatience fades. There is no need to rush the process because the outcome feels settled. The bridge does not exist to test faith or demand endurance. It exists to express an assumption already accepted. Money flows not as a reward for belief, but as a natural consequence of who you have become. And because it feels natural, it continues. There comes a stage in this inner shift that feels almost empty to the mind that is used to effort. The urgency to think about money fades. The impulse to discuss it, analyze it, or narrate its progress grows quiet. This is not suppression, and it is not avoidance. It is the natural stillness that follows possession. Neville referred to this condition as the Sabbath, a psychological rest that occurs when consciousness accepts that the work is finished. In this rest, nothing feels unresolved, so nothing demands attention. Silence in this sense is not passive, it is confirmatory. You do not speak about what you already own because there is no need to remind yourself or anyone else. Conversation ends where certainty begins. When money becomes part of the assumed background of life, it loses its emotional charge. It no longer defines success or failure. It simply supports movement. This is why those who feel financially settled often speak about money less, not more. Their silence is not secrecy, it is irrelevance. The Sabbath of money is marked by a distinct internal sensation. The mind no longer circles the subject looking for reassurance. There is no internal rehearsal of explanations, no anticipation of conversations, no urge to prove that things are improving. The subject of money settles into the same category as other stable facts of life. You do not wake up each morning wondering whether gravity will function. In the same way, money no longer requires constant acknowledgement to feel secure. This stillness can feel unfamiliar at first. For a long time, thinking about money may have felt synonymous with being responsible or aware. When that thinking stops, there can be a brief sense of disorientation, as though something important has been forgotten. Yet nothing has been lost. What has disappeared is the habit of monitoring. In its place is a quieter identity that does not need to check itself. The absence of inner commentary is the signal that assumption has taken root. From this state, money-related decisions become simpler. They are made without emotional overtones, without the background noise of fear or hope. Action feels proportionate rather than reactive. You respond to circumstances as they arise, instead of anticipating them in advance. This responsiveness is not careless, it is precise. It reflects trust in an order that no longer requires constant supervision. The Sabbath reveals a deeper identity because it shows what remains when striving ends. What remains is not passivity, but confidence without display. It is the knowledge that nothing needs to be forced, explained, or announced. Money continues to move, not because it is being managed mentally, but because the inner state no longer contradicts its presence. In this quiet, the law rests, and in resting, it confirms itself. At the core of Neville's teaching is a truth so simple that the mind often resists it. The moment you stop asking, you start receiving. This is not a metaphor or a motivational phrase. Asking assumes separation. It assumes that what you want exists somewhere outside of you and must be reached, persuaded, or earned. Receiving, on the other hand, assumes alignment. It signals that the matter is already settled inwardly, and the outer world is merely catching up. When this shift occurs, nothing needs to be forced, because nothing is being sought. Money has never been responding to the number of affirmations repeated, or the emotional intensity behind them. It has always been reflecting self-concept. The way you internally position yourself in relation to money determines whether it appears unstable or supportive. Words spoken from an identity of need cannot override that identity. They only decorate it. This is why repetition so often leads to fatigue rather than fulfillment. The law responds to who you believe yourself to be, not to what you are trying to say. Neville's mirror analogy captures this with precision. If the reflection appears distorted, the solution is not to argue with the mirror or demand that it change. The posture must change. The reflection follows automatically. Money operates in the same way. When it appears absent or delayed, it is revealing the inner stance being occupied. The moment that stance shifts from pleading to expectation, from effort to assumption, the reflection has no choice but to adjust. This understanding is echoed in the work of Joe Dispenza, who has shown that emotional independence restores natural flow. When the nervous system is no longer conditioned into longing and tension, it stops signaling lack. The body relaxes into coherence, and in that coherence, new outcomes arise without strain. Receiving no longer feels like a breakthrough. It feels like a return to balance. The end of this process is marked by quiet. There is no urgency to think about money, no impulse to talk about it, and no need to track its movement. The feeling of being financially settled precedes visible confirmation, and that feeling is stable because it is rooted in identity, not circumstances. In this state, techniques fall away naturally, and SATS becomes a familiar resting place rather than an effort. Neville's reminder stands unchanged. You do not ask, you assume. When this is lived rather than repeated, the struggle ends. Not because life becomes perfect, but because money stops being a question that needs to be answered. It becomes a normal part of the environment, reflecting an inner posture that no longer contradicts its presence.